Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live interactive weekly panel discussion which sheds light on big issues facing researchers, policymakers, and planners worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading schools of international affairs, including the Balsillie School in Canada, the American University in Washington, D.C., the University of Warwick in the UK, and partners in Addis Ababa, Japan, Germany, and elsewhere. Today's live stream production is entitled Containing Iran's Nuclear Program. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to serve as moderator for today's session. A warm welcome to all participants joining in the audience, and there are many of you today. We would invite you to direct any questions that you may have at the end of the session or towards the end of the session to our panelists, and we will do our best to channel them in the right direction. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those of you tuning in from outside of Canada, one of the actions that we take to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is a process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and Indigenous people have rights to this land. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, which is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is very important that we here at the school acknowledge the land upon which we are situated in all that we do, including Global Insights. To start off today's conversation, let's turn to our distinguished panel. Bijan Ahmadi is co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, a Canadian non-profit and non-partisan foreign policy think tank dedicated to promoting sustainable peace through diplomacy, dialogue, and constructive engagement. Bijan has also served on the executive board of multiple Canadian nonprofits, including as an executive member of the Canadian International Council in 2009 and 20, and as the president and CEO of the Iranian Canadian Congress from 2016 to 2018. He has been interviewed and referenced by major Canadian and Iranian media outlets on Canada-Iran policy, Jcpoa, and US-Iran relations. Christian Emery is a lecturer and international relations at University College London's School of Slavonic and East European Studies. He is the author of US Foreign Policy and the Iranian Revolution and has written extensively on US foreign policy, US-Iranian relations, and the Cold War in the Middle East. He's held teaching positions at the London School of Economics, Warwick University, and the University of Nottingham, and has been a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia and Carleton University. Negar Mortazavi is an Iranian-American journalist and a political analyst based in Washington. She has been covering Iranian affairs and US-Iran relations for over a decade. She is a columnist for The Independent and host of the Iran podcast. She is a frequent media analyst on Iran and US foreign policy and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, France 24, Al Jazeera, and many other media outlets in China, Turkey, and Israel. I should also say that Negar was named very recently as Forbes magazine's 30 most inspirational women. Congratulations, Negar. Joshua Rovner is associate professor at the School of International Service at the American University. He specializes in intelligence, strategy, and US foreign policy. Rovner is co-editor of Chaos in the Liberal Order, the Trump Presidency, and International Politics in the 21st Century. Thank you again, everyone, for sharing your insights with us today and being here. Arguably the most significant foreign policy accomplishment of the Obama administration was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the agreement between the Republic of Iran, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, Germany, and the European Union to curb Iran's nuclear enrichment program in exchange for relief on economic sanctions. But as we all know, President Trump withdrew the United States from this agreement in 2018. So I'd like to start with a discussion of the terms of the Jcpoa and their relevance in 2021. Joshua, can I start with you and ask you, what were the best arguments for the nuclear deal in 2015? Do they still apply today?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And it is kind of amazing to think about the fact that such extraordinary changes have happened over the last 5 to 6 years. But basically, the incentives are not that different from where they were when the Jcpoa was signed and came into operation. Right? The US wants non-proliferation. It wants to reduce the chance of war. And more broadly, it wants to focus less on the Middle East because its interests have been pulled in other directions. Iran, for its purposes, wants sanctions relief, but it also wants the ability to retain the scientific and engineering infrastructure of a nuclear program. So the basic desires are the same on both sides. I would say that there are a couple of additional things we need to think about. One is from a US perspective. There is an intelligence benefit from the deal itself, because one of the major points of Jcpoa was a really, really ambitious inspections regime on Iran's nuclear program. And the agreement itself specified that Iran had to agree to what's called the additional protocol indefinitely, right? What that means for US intelligence is that its intelligence agencies can look at other things, right? If they want to look at other aspects of the nuclear supply chain, they can do that. If they want to look to other countries, they can do that as well. So there's an intelligence benefit for the US today, especially given its broader interest.
Thanks very much. Bijan, over to you. Was Jcpoa successful in limiting Iran's nuclear program before Trump's withdrawal?
Yep. Hi, Anne. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me and for organizing this discussion. So one of the strong points of the Jcpoa was that all Iran's commitments were verifiable, and the IAEA was set as the independent body to verify Iran's commitments to nuclear obligations that it made under Jcpoa. So let's quickly review what we got under the deal. Both Iran's pathways to a nuclear bomb, the uranium path and the plutonium path, were blocked. Iran shipped out its 20% enriched uranium and agreed to keep its enrichment level to 3.7%. And it was only allowed to keep, even at that enrichment level, a limited quantity of enriched uranium. Jcpoa reduced Iran's centrifuges from around 20,000 to around 5,000. And those were the older and less efficient models of their centrifuges. And Iran also converted its heavy water reactor in Iraq to ensure that it doesn't produce plutonium that could be used for weapons production. As my fellow panelists also mentioned, they also agreed to implement the additional protocol voluntarily, which provided unprecedented level of access to IAEA inspector. So overall, Jcpoa, by implementing all these measures and more, pushed back Iran's breakout time from only a couple of months to over a year. So based on all this, yes, the deal was successful in rolling back Iran's nuclear program and in creating a robust inspection regime for IAEA to ensure that Iran doesn't move towards a nuclear weapon.
Thanks so much. Christian, over to you. What kind of policy in Iran has Biden inherited?
Hi, everyone. So the thing to think is that basically Biden has inherited a situation where Trump has obviously blown up this deal without any kind of clear idea of what he could replace it with. He's massively escalated regional tensions while saying he didn't really think it was America's responsibility to provide security there. So this maximum security policy he thought would force Iran to accept much more restrictions on its nuclear program and make fundamental changes to its domestic and foreign policies. But instead, obviously, it retaliated against Trump's bludgeoning sanctions by, stockpiling and enriching more uranium, shooting down American drones, attacking Saudi refineries, launching, via its proxies, attacks against US assets in Iran, harassing shipping in Straits of Hormuz. So aside from sort of manifestly failing in its own terms. Ultimately, we've got to a situation where when Trump came into power, there was about a 12-month breakout period if Iran decided to drop everything and build a nuclear weapon. Now we're about a 3-month breakout period. So clearly, on any measure, this has been a catastrophic handling of Iran policy. I think just to think about what a big legacy of this is that the big change, of course, is that Trump showed that the US alone could really cripple the Iranian economy. Think about how George Bush had sort of tried and failed to get crippling sanctions against Iran. Obama had succeeded because ultimately he persuaded the EU and others to sort of join with oil sanctions. What Trump did is he sort of drew on the absolute hegemony of the US dollar and financial market by this kind of new generation of sanctions to just unilaterally obliterate the Iranian economy. So I think it's worth remembering that this deal was backed by, amongst others, the 2 largest economies in the world, the European Union and China, and together they amount for about 35% of all global economic output. And yet they could not protect this deal. They could not offset the damage of US sanctions. So I think that's a big lesson here, is just that unilateral ability to destroy sanctions, and that has changed the dynamics. And as we know, sanctions are very hard to unpick once you enact them.
Nagar, why, in your view, has President Biden not returned to Jcpoa yet?
Well, we have to realize, as I would discuss, the maximum pressure campaign policy is something that the Biden administration has inherited from the Trump presidency. There's also the domestic politics here in the United States and Washington. We knew it was a very turbulent time of the election, the transition. Literally, the building was not being handed over to the next team until very last minute. And President Biden is also in the office with this mandate of uniting the country, uniting this town. So it's become very difficult for him. And there are very specific figures, both on the Republican side, who've been opposed to the negotiations, to the Jcpoa, even President Obama, and then also some powerful Democrats in his own party. I want to name names because this has been reported by multiple outlets here. For example, Senator Menendez, a powerful senator who is a Democrat, who sits on the House, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but he's had a more hawkish view or tough view on Iran. He opposed the Jcpoa under President Obama, and it seems like there's some holdup in what the Biden team can do and pursue. And there's also this general understanding, I think misunderstanding at the White House, that it's Iran who's the desperate party here. It's Iran who wants very fast sanctions relief. It's Iran who can't wait, and that the United States can afford to wait, and that they shouldn't rush into returning to Jcpoa, and that essentially turning President Trump's maximum pressure policy into what some in Washington see as leverage, quote unquote leverage. I don't think it's providing leverage. I think the window of opportunity is very short. I can talk about that later. But I think this is the general overview of what President Biden is dealing with, both domestically and then also as far as outlooks, and then also forces within the administration. Some are more closer to diplomacy and that thought of supporting the Jcpoa. Some of these people were actually the diplomats who did the negotiations and made that agreement, but some have more tough views on Iran. There's always that internal discussion also happening within the administration.
So Iran and US have been at odds with each other ever since the hostage crisis, really in the late 1970s. So Bijan, how the deal survived despite Trump's withdrawal from the deal and Pompeo's attempt to snap back the UN Security Council sanctions? Can you comment on this?
Yeah, so I think the deal survived because Iran reacted to Trump's withdrawal from the deal with significant restraint. And also the other signatories, E3, China, and Russia, tried to keep the deal alive. So let's quickly review what happened since US withdrawal. For almost a year, the first year after Trump's decision to reimpose sanctions, Iran followed through with all its commitments under the Jcpoa. Iranians hoped that by showing strategic patience and staying in the deal, they could get help from other participants of the Jcpoa and wait for another administration in the White House. During this period, we saw that there were attempts to establish alternative financial channels for Iran. One of these channels, the main one, was called Instex. However, these efforts by and large failed, and Europeans were unable to deliver any meaningful financial benefit to Iran. So after the first year, Iranian leaders decided to remain in JCPOA but used two provisions in the agreement, paragraph 26 and 36, as far as I remember, to reduce their commitments. But even from this point on, they did this step by step in 5 different stages. After this point, we also observed increasing activities of Iran-backed regional proxies. For example, the attacks on Aramco facilities. The Iranian strategists, if you listen to them, they call this revised approach active resistance, quote unquote. And their thinking was that other members of JCPOA cannot help Iran financially to fight US sanctions. Therefore, Iran must impose costs on US and its regional allies for them to realize that they need to negotiate a solution with Iran. Now, Europeans couldn't help Iran financially against US sanctions, but their position in supporting the deal and in not siding with Trump administration provided Iran with enough incentive in terms of political support to convince Iran to stay in the deal, because Tehran wanted to avoid an international consensus, especially in the United Nations Security Council. So the deal is alive because of the efforts and actions of the remaining parties to the JCPOA.
Thanks so much. Nagar, what's the direction of US foreign policy at the moment with Iran?
Well, I think the direction or the intent, the goal is to revive diplomacy, even though direct talks haven't happened and both sides are sort of in this game of chicken of who goes first. You take the first step, you first lift sanctions, no, you come back into the deal. So I think there's been some back and forth when it comes there. The Europeans are trying to mediate, the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, has stepped in to try to, you know, create some space and some time for the two sides to try to bring them together. I think the Biden administration is intending to return to negotiations and diplomacy with Iran. The timeline is not very clear for us here. Even in Washington, it seems like the different forces, the competing forces in Washington are still in that fight. But I think in the long term, the intent is to de-escalate tensions. It's something President Biden has said numerous times, his top advisors have said, to try to use diplomacy instead of military tension to resolve issues with Iran. And resolving issues with Iran is not just Iran and the US. A lot of other issues in the region are tied to this US-Iran political fight. So eventually, President Biden has also signaled that he's intending to discuss other issues beyond the nuclear program, which is something the Obama team didn't have the time back then to pursue. So Iran's regional policy, bringing other US allies into the discussions, and then eventually reaching other agreements beyond the scope of the JCPOA.
Joshua, what, in your view, should the US try to achieve in new talks with Iran?
Yeah, just to follow on Nagar's excellent comments there. I think there's 3 ways you can look at how the US will approach diplomacy. There's the narrow goal of restoring JCPOA and focusing strictly on the nuclear issue. There's a second approach, which is more coercive, which is trying to use these negotiations to force Iran to stop supporting militant groups and building out ballistic missiles and so forth. This was akin to what the Trump administration was doing. And then there's this third option, which is to look for a more comprehensive settlement, some sort of grand bargain, which deals not just with the nuclear issue, but broader regional security issues. And this is something that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan floated last year in Foreign Affairs, and Zarif kind of replied in Foreign Affairs as well, right? Also talking about this more regional approach. My preference is to keep it narrowly focused on the nuclear issue, because I do view the domestic politics in both countries as being quite tenuous, giving us a narrow window of opportunity. And I think that broadening out and trying to seek a very comprehensive deal might be too much to ask for at this point.
Christian, how does Biden's policy, in your view, in Iran fit into his wider foreign policy?
Well, I think Biden's policy in the region is still shaping up. He's got a lot of domestic and international priorities ahead of the Middle East probably right now. I think the logic between the Iran deal and the wider strategy in the Middle East seems sort of similar to the Obama one, and he thinks that this sort of heavy US footprint in the Middle East has not given the US good outcomes, and that doing a deal on the Iranian nuclear issue is the only way that the US can really avoid a major confrontation in the Middle East, which it has absolutely no appetite to do. And I think just as Obama sort of saw the nuclear deal as a stepping stone to the next phase of a broader regional kind of security cooperation process, ideally, I think that's probably his view too. I think what else we can see is that he is seeking a different relationship with Saudi Arabia. He's more willing to kind of call them out, perhaps on particularly policies in Yemen and human rights issues. Probably will be less cozy towards Netanyahu. And those, I guess, are two good sort of structural forces acting in favor of the deal, I suppose. But it works both ways. I think he will also be a bit more vocal on human rights in a way that, wasn't hard to be more vocal on human rights than Donald Trump. So that would also probably impact negatively in terms of Iran, like that. I think my own sort of general view on this is we're not in a post-America Middle East yet, but we are clearly in a situation where it's a decreasing strategic importance for the US, and that I actually think is helpful for the deal. In other words, put another way, if Obama was still projecting power into the region, we'd have got a deal. I think what happened is eventually Iran realized that both sides shared the same goal, a reduction in the US military footprint and a de-escalation of the conflict, and that actually cooperating was the best way to actually get what both really wanted, was to get America less heavily involved in or a militarized foreign policy in the region.
But from the very get-go, the Jcpoa was controversial, and there's domestic opposition in the US to going back to the negotiating table. So Christian, can I push back at you and ask, why does Biden want to come back to the nuclear deal?
Well, because he thought, rightly I think, that it was working, that it was effectively preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon, and because it would eventually hopefully lead to a broader settlement on other regional issues. And also, clearly he takes the view, again, which I would share, that the alternative, maximum pressure, is not giving good outcomes. Now he's kind of trapped into the maximum pressure and, is still sort of tied to it, but the ambition, of course, is to get over it. Also, I think, ultimately he wants to define himself in opposition to Trump and restore America's credibility and reputation as a country that sticks to international agreements. So, that's the same thing that's driving his willingness to repair the transatlantic relationship, is also driving his willingness to sort of repair America's reputation on the international stage as a country that sticks to its international obligations, and because he also knows that this deal is popular with key US allies. So, all roads point towards his desire to repair this deal.
Nagar, what is the position of Congress, Democrats and Republicans on diplomacy with Iran?
So I briefly mentioned a powerful senator on the Democratic side, Senator Menendez, who's basically right now the most vocal or most powerful voice opposed to this return to the Jcpoa on the Democratic side. And the interesting thing in the US Senate is that they have this small margin, the 50-50 vote. So every vote counts, and not just on Iran and foreign policy. The Biden team needs their Democrats in the Senate for other issues. COVID now being the top item on the agenda of the Biden administration is still ongoing, discussions, the fights, and beyond that, other issues. Also, we know climate change is something that when it comes to their world policy, the Biden administration is definitely prioritizing, as opposed to the Trump administration, or basically reversing the policy. So that dynamic in the Congress exists. And then there's also the long-time opposition to the Jcpoa, and frankly to any deal with Iran. I don't believe that the Republicans, at least many of the Republicans, would accept any kind of agreement with Iran. But of course, the JCPOA was something that they opposed under the Obama administration. They continue to oppose it, to oppose a return to the deal. And when President Biden talks about this uniting of the country, it's something that an attack line that we specifically hear from the Republicans, a lot of Republican strategists, think tank world here in Washington, when it comes to his Iran agenda, that somehow returning back to the JCPOA, which is an Obama era deal, is going to go against his promises of uniting. So I think that Congress is still pretty much as divided as it was under President Obama. When the nuclear negotiations were happening, when the JCPOA was made, there were a few Democrats who opposed President Obama's JCPOA. It was very narrowly accepted in Congress back then. And I think those lines pretty much exist still now, with the very interesting exception of Senator Chuck Schumer. Senator Chuck Schumer was a vocal critic of the JCPOA back then, but then he criticized, or he at least joined the chorus of critics when President Trump pulled out of the deal. And now it seems like he's not as vocal as Senator Menendez when it comes to opposing a return to the JCPOA, which I think goes back again to the domestic dynamics of the country.
Joshua, in your view, what does success look like? How will we know a decade from now whether these negotiations have worked out well?
I think that in one sense, it's a matter of determining whether the inspectors can get back on site, what IAEA quarterly reports look like, is Iran back in compliance with the deal, is there a reasonable level of uranium enrichment, right? Essentially, is it going nuclear or not? There's other ways of thinking about success, though. One is in terms of domestic politics here in the US. Is Iran a litmus issue for American presidential candidates, right? Is this a page one issue for future political candidates, or is it something that's not animating a lot of discussion? If it's not a page one issue, I count that as a success, right? If it is, that aggravates the domestic problems and makes it harder to get to a stable outcome. Internationally, and in terms of US grand strategy, I think success looks like this. Since the 1970s, the US has committed itself to what it calls security and stability in the Gulf. And the US has spent a lot of blood and treasure trying to achieve that very ambiguous goal. If the US decides that as part of a new deal, it has to be the guarantor of some grand bargain, I worry that it's going to be obligating itself to come back again and again and again, which again is one reason why we should look at the nuclear issue as something narrow and as something that does not need to be tied to a long-term US role.
Bijan, similarly, in your view, can the Biden administration expand the scope of the JCPOA to address Iran's missile program or its support for militia groups?
And I have serious doubts that the Biden administration can expand the scope of the agreement, at least in the immediate term. But if the Biden administration successfully revives the nuclear deal with Iran and considers the nuclear deal as a platform, as a basis for trust building between the US and Iran, then in the longer term, we can be hopeful that there will be room for more talks. And to understand why expanding the deal is not possible or not feasible, we have to think back about why the initial JCPOA was limited to Iran's nuclear program. And then we see that same conditions apply today. So let's give an example, Iran's missile program. There is no realistic path that Iran would agree to disarm itself from one of the only effective military capabilities it has, while US allies have significant conventional military capabilities, and every year they purchase billions of dollars of military equipment from United States, Europe, and our country, Canada, or about Iranian regional activities. So we call them in the West, and we consider them as Iran malign behavior. But Iranians consider their presence in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon as a forward deterrence against the United States, and in particular against Israel, the only nuclear armed power in the Middle East. So same as the Obama era, I believe today the nuclear program is the main issue that needs to be addressed urgently and the only issue that can be solved effectively through a feasible solution and through perhaps a short-term negotiations returning to the Jcpoa.
Nigar, you published a piece recently in Foreign Policy magazine that was entitled, or saying that President Biden must follow the advice of candidate Biden on Iran. Can you explain to us why President Biden is different than candidate Biden?
Well, I think it mostly comes back to the delay in this return to the Jcpoa. Having explained all the dynamics of US domestic politics, at the end of the day, as me and my co-author explained in that piece, President Biden criticized candidate Biden, or even before he was a candidate, criticized President Trump's policy on Iran, maximum pressure. He criticized President Trump when he pulled out of the Jcpoa. He said President Trump is manufacturing a crisis with Iran, that a new deal is an illusion, and that the Jcpoa is basically the best deal that's available. Everything that we're discussing about the Jcpoa has at some point been either said by Joe Biden before he was president, or his top advisors, Jake Sullivan and others around him. And some of the diplomats that he has in his team are actually the people who did make the Jcpoa and back then defend it. But I think the delay that the Biden team is continuing in returning back to Jcpoa, or essentially reviving diplomacy, has in essence resulted in a continuation of maximum pressure, because President Biden didn't start with a blank slate. He took over the maximum pressure campaign, but he's now the driver of that car, and it's going at full speed in the very direction that President Trump was driving. And so maximum pressure continues for ordinary Iranians on the ground, dealing with the economic an economy that's almost crashing under a pandemic. Nothing has changed for those Iranians, and it's as if President Trump has left, but for US policy towards Iran, not much has changed.
So Christian, what difficulties does he face in bringing both the US and Iran back into compliance?
Well, it's the choreography, effectively, of who moves first. It's the rebuilding of the trust. It's the technical difficulty of unpicking the sanctions. It's the Iranian domestic context with an upcoming election. But I think this deal ultimately, can be salvaged. The basic solution of sanctions relief for reduction of enrichment, it's the same logic. The situation of who's going to oversee this, there's a built-in solution already achieved. The same personnel are even going to be there. I think Biden's appointed some really brilliant picks here. Richard Nephew understands the sanctions issue back to front. Bill Burns is an absolutely brilliant diplomat. Rob Malley was involved in the first deal. These are people who know it. So they're going to be dealing with people who there are, 5 years ago is a long time, but there is some residual trust there. The same structural forces that I mentioned, I think, are still driving towards this deal. Both leaderships really want and need it. Also, you've got to think Iran is not really giving away anything that it's strategically vital in the same way like regional proxies or missiles. It's not giving away something that is totally, it's unwilling to give away. The domestic politics are hard, but ultimately, Biden does have a slim majority. We've just seen 140 lawmakers, sign a letter saying that they want to do this deal. I think that the Democrats who are skeptical of this deal, are they really going to want to defeat Biden on a major foreign policy issue early on in his administration? And the same kind of, he'll do the same thing that Obama said. Look, what's your alternative? Here's my deal. This is avoidance of major conflict. If you don't like it, what's your solution? So, the choreography is difficult, but it was before. The lack of trust was difficult, but it was before. The lack of trust, I suppose, is much harder now because this sort of capricious nature of Trump and the fact that the Iranians can't be sure that another Trump won't come along in 4 years and do the same thing. But, I think the sequencing will be difficult, but this is also where the Europeans and others can play a key role.
So Bijan, what happens if the US doesn't rejoin the agreement, or at least in the immediate term, or if talks with Iran fail?
Yeah. So in short term, I think Iran wants to ensure that making a decision on Jcpoa remains a priority for the Biden administration. So they're going to keep up the pressure, and I think that will be on two fronts. So As we have witnessed in recent weeks, there will be increased regional activities by Iran-backed forces. And also building up on its previous steps, Iran will take additional measures to expand its nuclear program, increase its enriched uranium stockpile, and limit inspections further. In medium to long term, if the sanctions remain in place, if talks fail, if talks first form and then fail, in my opinion, Iran will invest further in improving its capabilities, domestic capabilities, and by that I mean military capabilities, its missile program, its drone program, and its regional proxies. I also think they will try to deepen relations with China. The sanctions over the years have already strengthened Iran's relations with China, and there are talks of a longer-term strategic agreement between the two countries. Now, my assessment is that currently Iran does not want to move towards developing a nuclear bomb. But there is concern that if the maximum pressure continues, especially in more aggressive forms that we witnessed during the Trump era, sabotage, targeted assassinations, then it is possible that Iranians will revisit their nuclear doctrine and make an ultimate decision to move towards a bomb. In recent years, with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and then the Iranian nuclear scientist Fakhrizadeh inside Iran, inside Iranian territory, and the sabotage operations at Iranian nuclear facilities, there is a growing belief inside Iran that their current capabilities cannot effectively deter Israel and the United States. And I'm concerned that if Trump's policy of maximum pressure continues, and to this date it has, as Negar mentioned as well, it might push Iran towards developing nuclear deterrence.
Joshua, what happens if the negotiations fail?
One thing to remember about non-proliferation negotiations is that they don't end, right? We know this from the whole history of the nuclear age, that when states make important moves towards a nuclear program, or if some non-proliferation effort breaks down, it's not as if the US just throws its hands up in despair and gives up. This has never been the case, right? In all of the other cases in which non-proliferation policy has been ongoing. So what would happen in this case, I suspect, would be that diplomacy continues just at different levels. Diplomacy would become a little more informal and not formal and staged. It would sometimes go behind the scenes and in back channels. Somebody mentioned that Bill Burns is now involved as director of the CIA. Well, he's a longtime diplomat, and the title of his memoir was The Back Channel. So they're very familiar with how to keep talks ongoing, even in difficult situations, right? In the event that a quick return to Jcpoa breaks down. And I think that they probably recognize that the alternatives are much worse, that the maximum pressure didn't perform as advertised, and it actually made things worse. So I think that there would be disappointment, but not resignation. And I think that diplomacy would continue at lower levels.
So what steps should stakeholders take in making sure that this deal does not fail? Bijan, to you first, was President Trump's maximum pressure policy successful in curbing Iran's nuclear or missile program and its regional actions?
Not at all, in my opinion, and you can simply look at each area of concern. Iran's nuclear program has expanded after the US withdrawal from the Jcpoa. Their ballistic missile program is stronger today, and Iranians have demonstrated their capability to use their missiles even to target US forces in the Middle East. And according to many experts who track regional activities, the maximum pressure has not stopped or weakened the militia groups supported by Iran in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, or Yemen. Simply look at Yemen and Saudi Arabia in recent weeks. Or in Iraq today, there are new militia groups carrying out operations that did not even exist a couple of years ago. Trump's maximum pressure campaign failed to achieve its publicly stated objectives, the 12 demands that Pompeo famously outlined. But many people believe from beginning that the main purpose was regime change in Tehran for the maximum pressure. However, Trump's strategy failed to achieve that as well. And in some aspects, today, Islamic Republic has a stronger grip on power, and the factions that have supported engagement and dialogue with the West have lost public support and are weaker today. Now, the US sanctions, we have to be realistic and understand that it has severely weakened Iran's economy. And perhaps that's the main reason why Iran's regional rivals believe that the pressure was successful and have maintained their support for this policy. But this is where I think in the West we need to realize that our interests are not necessarily aligned with the Saudis or Israelis with respect to Iran. Preventing Iran from developing its economy by imposing a complex web of sanctions on that country might be good for its competitors in the region, but it's not going to address the core issues we have in the West with Iran, namely their nuclear program, their missile proliferation, or their regional influence and activities.
So, Christian, what are your views on the role that other states can play, principally the other signatories of the JCPOA?
I think for me, the Europeans are the key actors here. I think that's because, Biden wants to repair relations across the Atlantic anyway. So they're going to be close to the US, but also they've got the moral credibility, the moral high ground with the Iranians of having criticized the Trump's abrogation and have done their best to sort of keep the deal going. So I think they can play that crucial link. And you actually saw it was the Europeans who actually formally invited the Americans back in February to sort of come back into negotiations. I think also because Iran has made clear that it won't meet senior officials from America until there's sanctions relief, well, that sort of means there's going to be a lot of indirect diplomacy. And again, I think this is where the Europeans can go. I think also the Americans would probably negotiate or work with the Europeans first and then go to the Chinese and the Russians. But I mean, ultimately, the most important probably is that the Europeans can play this crucial role in this choreography, the who moves who, the compliance for compliance, because I think the Iranians will accept a timetable that's sort of brokered by the Europeans. I think there's also in terms of offsetting sanctions, which are going to be very difficult to unpick quickly. What they, what the Europeans might be able to do is use some of their payment clearing systems, Instex, to actually funnel sanctions relief to the Iranians quickly before actually the whole architecture of the financial sanctions are removed. They can also maybe hope to sort of broker this sort of more regional dialogue. Britain's got links with Oman and these countries who traditionally played a role in facilitating diplomacy. So yeah, those three things.
Nagar, in your foreign policy piece, you alluded to the fact that the window of opportunity is closing. Tell us more on that. Why is that?
We have a very important date coming up, which is the Iranian presidential election in June, and that would be the end of President Rouhani's terms, as it was discussed. There are some excellent diplomats on the Biden side who were involved with the negotiations of the JCPOA, and the same goes for the other side. It's basically the same two teams that knew each other, that talked to each other. They can just sit back at the table and start where they left off under the Obama time. If this team changes in Tehran, and it's very likely that it would change into a more hardline position. We have now IRGC figures rising up for the presidential season, and the moderates have been weakened in the era of maximum pressure. The moderates used to tell the hardliners, don't blame us for Trump. This is an anomaly. There's going to be more normalcy coming back to American politics. But if this doesn't happen under President Biden, this is just going to give the upper hand to the hardliners, further weaken the moderates. And once a hardline president takes over, a hardline team comes into place, I think a return to JCPOA as a first step would be much more complicated with a new team, a more hardline team. It's just reminiscent of the Ahmadinejad era before the Rouhani team came in, and eventually the negotiations happened with the Obama team. So I think it will be very more complicated, and the next couple of months are very, very essential for the Biden team to move quick.
Thank you. And Joshua, very quickly, what happens if Iran gets the bomb?
If Iran gets the bomb, that is, if they build a weapon and test it visibly, well, then American policymakers are going to be in a position they don't want to be, which is deterrence, right? And policymakers don't like talking about deterrence. It's not emotionally satisfying, but that's what we're that's what we're going to do. And I think the recent experience of North Korea is telling. Right? American policymakers going way back have said we will not tolerate North Korea with a nuclear program. Well, then it went nuclear. And the US has tried to figure out various ways of deterring North Korea from various threatening actions with that small arsenal. If the same happened with Iran, I think the US would have to get serious about how to deter Iran from various threatening actions. That's the bad news. The good news is that I think that the US is in a really good place to do that, right? Whether or not the fear is that Iran would deliver technologies to militant groups, proxies, whether Iran would use nuclear weapons as a cover for conventional aggression, or whether Iran would even consider using nuclear weapons, the US has a lot of ways of stopping each of those behaviors, right? And it won't like it, but I think that that's how the US would go forward.
Thank you. So there's a question that's similar to that, actually, from Ernesto Fraga. How would the US make sure that Iran would not build a nuclear weapon once the deal ends? So Bijan, can you comment on that?
Sure. So in the agreement, Iran is actually committing that it will never develop nuclear weapons. Iran is also a party to NPT. And as part of the deal, it agreed to voluntarily implement the additional protocol indefinitely, as one of the fellow panelists mentioned as well. So if we have those measures in place, I believe that even with those current measures in Jcpoa, we can ensure that Iran is not going to move towards nuclear weapons. Also, there will be no interest for Iran to move towards that direction, because then it will be isolated completely. And Iran is not a country that you can compare to North Korea in terms of their thinking, that they go and to the direction of isolating themselves to that extent. So I think that the current deal can ensure that Iran will not develop nuclear weapons, but also, as other panelists mentioned, non-proliferation is a continuous process. There will be need for more talks, and those talks can ensure the measures that are needed by IAEA to inspect the Iranian nuclear program.
Thanks so much. And Nagar, over to you for a question from Roxana Bakramitash. She says, what I don't understand is that before the deal, I heard a lot of anxiety about if Iran was going to abide to her promise. Now we saw that it was not Iran who broke the deal, it was the US. My question is why there is a lack of confidence on both sides when in actual fact, Iran has not broken her deal.
It's a great question, and I agree. There might be a lot of Iran's foreign policy, regional policy, even domestic issues that we don't like, but when it comes to the Jcpoa, President Trump unilaterally pulled out of the deal. The Iranians stayed in the deal in full compliance for a full year even afterwards, and then they started reducing, what the nuclear experts call reducing compliance to the deal, but they're still in the deal. So on this issue, I think, as we explained in our foreign policy piece, President Trump broke it, but President Biden has to repair it because it was the United States who pulled out. If you go back to European statements, if you go back to Democrats and even President Biden's own words when it comes to the Jcpoa, it was the US who was the deal breaker. And that's why I think they should take the first step back into the Jcpoa.
Thank you. A question for you, Christian, from Barbara Taylor. Is there a real threat of Iran's nuclear program to global security, or is the effort to denuclearize Iran an attempt for Western nations, such as the US, to extend their sphere of control in the Middle East? Please comment.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there is a threat in terms of proliferation, and just, it's not in anyone's interest, apart from Iran's, perhaps, to build a nuclear weapon. Is this a proxy for just sort of an attempt to sort of, spread control in the Middle East? Well, this is what the Iranians have always felt. They thought, well, if we give in on the nuclear issue, they'll go on the human rights issue. And if we give in on the human rights issue, they'll go on the regional policies issues. And it's not one thing, it'll be the other. I come back to my original point, is that I actually think that this comes from a position of America actually seeing that the Middle East is becoming less important to it, and actually not wanting to get bogged down in it, and seeing a deal with Iran as vital to any strategic pivot, for example, towards Asia or something like that. So I actually think the opposite. I think America is trying to demilitarize and de-engage from the Middle East, and sees the deal in those terms.
Okay, well, talking about the region then, there's a question about the impact of the Iranian elections on hardliners and Iran's regional agenda. Joshua, can you comment on that?
I'm not expert on Iran's politics, so I would defer to some of my colleagues. That said, I think that the general trend has been pretty clear that up to now, President Rouhani has been open to negotiations, and there is this fear that there's new elements in the Iranian leadership that are much more combative. And that, as Nagar, I think, correctly said, there is a window of opportunity here which could change Iranian policy going forward.
Okay, Bijan, do you want to pick that up? Because there's a few other questions that focus on this issue of regionalism.
Sure, yeah. So I believe also the time is of the essence with respect to returning to the Jcpoa. There is limited window of opportunity here, but I disagree a little bit with Nagar on the Iranian election. And going to this question, I think relatively Iran's sort of, if we want to call it a grand strategy with respect to its foreign policy, is established through consensus among the Islamic Republic elites and establishment. And because of that, I think their approach overall to US and to Jcpoa will remain the same. There might be some changes in attitudes, rhetoric, and approach, but still, I believe the fundamental strategy will remain the same, no matter whether the principalists or the moderates take over and win in the next election. But the Jcpoa, there is limited time because eventually, as Iran takes further steps in reducing its commitments, I believe we're going to be at a stage that there won't be much left in the deal to return to.
Christian, could you tell us about Israel? Is Israel a realistic threat to Iran beyond efforts to disrupt activities, etc.? Can you comment on that?
Well, Israel is the only nuclear-powered state in the region, so on that basis, it clearly is a threat. There's an imbalance of power there, but you know, it's not. Israel's not looking to start a war with Iran. I don't believe. You know, I think actually, if you look deep down, I think within the security establishment in Israel, there's a lot of support for this deal because they think it was actually working in preventing a nuclear weapon. And I don't think, you know, they would be that opposed, although they want certainly tighter restrictions. They want the removal of some of these sunset clauses that exist on this, and they probably want to ramp up the pressure to get a better deal in the first place. Ultimately, I think that it's in Israel's interest to get this deal done as well.
Nagar, are Biden's advisors preparing for the possibility that Rouhani's coalition will lose the upcoming elections in June? The questioner says, I mean, is there any recognition for urgency in your view?
Well, I think there are people on the Biden team like Rob Malley, someone like Bill Burns and Wendy Sherman just going into the team, people who understand Iranian politics very well. But this also goes back to the overall, you know, atmosphere of the White House, the competing forces, and then also Congress, and then the domestic politics of the US. So as far as their action of the Biden administration, I don't see that sense of urgency. I'm sure there are people inside who understand the politics as much as I do and the urgency, but so far it's clear that they haven't been successful in pushing for this to become a priority. And I think the president himself or some very senior people, maybe Secretary of State, need to take a bold step and spend some political capital to make this happen quickly. And that hasn't happened yet.
Bijan, could you say something about, or a little bit more about Saudi's stake in any new negotiations?
I tried to sort of talk about this a little. I believe that the regional countries, regional competitors of Iran, including Saudis, what they got out of the maximum pressure was that the sanctions contained Iran's ability to develop its economy overall. So for a competitor, that was an advantage. I think Saudis were hopeful that it would also achieve some of the 12-point demands that Pompeo outlined, but it didn't. It failed to achieve that. Now, I truly don't see a barrier for the Saudis to come to terms with some sort of regional dialogue in Persian Gulf with Iranians. I think that needs to happen with some persuasion and convincing from the Biden administration after revival of the deal. So that needs some pressure from the Biden administration, but there is no incentive for Saudis to, if they see that the sanctions are going away and the JCPOA is going to be in effect, there won't be much incentives for Saudis to keep tensions high in the Persian Gulf region. And I think at that point, they will come to terms with some sort of regional dialogue, at least in the Persian Gulf region.
Thank you so much for fielding all of those questions. I know we've got more, but I want to put a final question out to all of you and do a quick tour de table on the question of what are your top tips for the policy world at the moment. We have a number of policymakers in the audience. So Christian, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think we've all agreed that they should start small and not add other things into this deal, that they need a bit of space. They need to kind of create the atmosphere where they can pause these things, rebuild the trust. They've got the personnel in there that should be able to do this. I think another really important thing they need to do is they need to give clear guidance to the private sector on how sanctions are going to be interpreted, because the lesson from when Obama got rid of the sanctions was that the private sector still didn't really know what could and couldn't be done, and that actually prevented Iran from reaping the benefits of the deal, and they quickly soured to it. And then just the third one quickly, I think, is that the US should be using a lot more soft power here in terms of financial power to help mobilize efforts on pandemic relief, social economic recovery, these kinds of stuff that will just really help to build the atmospherics and tangibly benefit people's lives in the region.
Thanks so much. Joshua, what are your thoughts?
I would move quickly to restore talks to bring back the JCPOA, but I'd also prepare for long-term diplomacy, regardless of what happens over the next few months. I really doubt that the outcome here is going to be binary, either complete success or complete failure. So the Biden administration should be thinking about what it will do at this time next year, depending on how the next few months play out. And the other suggestion I would have is just set modest expectations, right? Do not shoot for the moon here. There's a lot of antipathy in the history of US-Iranian relations, and there are sort of deep and abiding problems. So I think that progress on the nuclear issue is enough. If other things come in the future, that's good too, but keep expectations limited. Okay,
thank you. Bijan, 30 seconds, top tip for the policymakers.
Sure. So as I discussed this earlier, return to JCPOA. I think EU and regional actors such as Qatar are well placed to choreograph the sequence of this return. JCPOA will address concerns regarding Iran's nuclear program. However, the nuclear deal is not going to resolve all problems in the Middle East. For that, regional dialogue is needed. JCPOA was not designed to achieve that and resolve all issues. The regional dialogue, I think it can start from the Persian Gulf region. So my second recommendation is for US to convince MBS and the Saudis and facilitate a regional dialogue after the revival of the JCPOA.
Thank you. Nigar, finish us off.
Again, I think a quick return to the JCPOA, the sooner the better, the easier. Other issues I think can be possible in the long term, but when we talk about negotiations and potential deals, we always have to remember it's a give and take. You go to the table, you give something, you take something. It's not unilateral. It's not like Mike Pompeo's 12 conditions for Iran, none of which were made under maximum pressure. And then also the issue of pandemic. I agree with both Christian and Josh when it comes to the financial sector, and then also in general US leadership on the vaccine, on medical supplies, on using the power and the credibility of the Europeans, of the international community, and not just for the pandemic, the medical side, but also moving beyond human rights, the issue of dual national prisoners in Iran. All of these can be done when there's a diplomatic atmosphere and ecosystem ready for all of these side talks.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists for what I am sure you will all agree was a great discussion. You are all very, very bright and engaged on this issue, and we wish you well with your continued research. We hope the audience enjoyed it, and we hope you'll join us next week as well. Same link, same time for our final episode of the season, a look at democratic and undemocratic protests. Until then, thanks so much, take care and stay safe.